The basement of Stanford University's psychology building was silent. It was Sunday, August 14, 1971, day 6 of what was supposed to be a 2-week experiment. But in the makeshift prison cells, something had gone horribly wrong. The guards were torturing the prisoners. The prisoners were breaking down, and the man running it all was taking notes. Dr. Philip Zimbardo checked his watch. Another count was starting. The prisoners would be dragged from their cells, forced to stand in line, humiliated for hours. He adjusted the hidden camera. This was exactly the data the government wanted. How long before ordinary people became monsters? How much pressure before good men did evil things? But Zimbardo didn't know that one of his prisoners was dying inside. Prisoner 416 had stopped eating, stopped talking, stopped responding to his real name. He believed he was actually a prisoner. He believed he would never leave. He believed the experiment was his life now. What Zimbardo also didn't know was that his girlfriend was about to walk into that basement and see what he had created. And when she did, she would scream the words that finally ended the nightmare. What you are doing to those boys is a terrible thing. But here's what nobody talks about. This wasn't just a university psychology experiment gone wrong. Declassified documents would later reveal the Stanford Prison Experiment was funded by the Office of Naval Research. The data went straight to the military. The techniques discovered in that basement would be used in real prisons, real interrogations, real torture chambers around the world. This is the story they don't want you to hear. The story of how the CIA and military used Stanford students as guinea pigs to develop psychological torture techniques. The story of how ordinary people were turned into sadists in less than 36 hours. The story that proves the monster inside us all is just waiting for permission to come out. It started with a newspaper ad. Male college students needed for psychological study of prison life. $15 per day for 1-2 weeks. 70 students answered. They were given personality tests, background checks, interviews. Zimbardo wanted the most normal, most stable, most average young men he could find. He found them. 24 clean-cut Stanford students with no criminal records, no psychological issues, no history of violence. They were randomly assigned, 12 guards, 12 prisoners, a coin flip that would destroy some of their lives. Craig Haney was one of Zimbardo's graduate students helping run the experiment. Years later, he would admit what they were really looking for. We wanted to know how fast we could break people, how quickly we could strip away identity, how easily we could make normal people do terrible things. But wait, it gets worse. On Sunday morning, real Palo Alto police officers arrived at the students' homes. The prisoners were arrested in front of their neighbors, handcuffed, read their rights. They thought it was part of the realism. They didn't know Zimbardo had arranged it with the police chief. They didn't know the experiment had already begun. Doug Corpy, prisoner 8612, still remembers the shock. I was eating breakfast when they knocked. My roommate watched them put me in the police car. It felt real, too real. That's when something shifted in my head. At the police station, they were booked, fingerprinted, photographed, then blindfolded and driven to Stanford. When the blindfolds came off, they were in a basement converted into a prison. 3 cells made from laboratory rooms. A closet converted into the whole, solitary confinement. A hallway that became the yard. The guards were waiting. They wore khaki uniforms, mirror sunglasses, billy clubs. They had been given only one instruction: maintain order. No guidelines, no limits, no rules about what they couldn't do. Guard Christopher Archer later testified. They told us we couldn't hit them. That was it. Everything else was up to us. We had complete power over when they ate, when they slept, when they used the bathroom. Complete power. Here's the first sign something was wrong. Within hours, the guards had created their own rules. Prisoners had to ask permission to do anything: eat, sleep, use the toilet. They had to address guards as Mr. Correctional Officer. They had to recite their prisoner numbers instead of names. Tom Thompson, prisoner 2093, describes the first day. They stripped us naked, sprayed us with delousing powder, made us wear dresses with no underwear, they called them smocks, put chains on our ankles, nylon caps on our heads. We looked like fools. That was the point. But the humiliation was calculated. Every detail designed to break down identity. The numbers instead of names. The dresses to emasculate. The chains to remind them they weren't free. The random rules to create confusion and dependence. By the first night, the guards were already improvising tortures. Prisoners who broke arbitrary rules did push-ups, then push-ups with other prisoners sitting on their backs, then push-ups while guards stepped on them. Physical punishment disguised as exercise. Dave Eshelman, the guard who would become known as John Wayne for his sadistic behavior, explains his transformation. I watched Cool Hand Luke the night before. I decided to be the worst guard imaginable. I thought it was method acting. I didn't realize I was becoming the character. At 2:30 a.m., the first surprise count began. Prisoners dragged from sleep, lined up, forced to recite their numbers. Anyone who got it wrong started over. The count lasted 2 hours. Some prisoners were still learning their numbers. The guards found this hilarious. But here's where the CIA connection becomes clear. Dr. Zimbardo wasn't just recording what happened. He was testing specific hypotheses about psychological control. Documents released in 2011 show the Office of Naval Research wanted to understand the psychology of imprisonment for military applications. They wanted to know how to break enemy prisoners, how to train guards for POW camps, how to survive capture. The Stanford basement was a laboratory for developing torture techniques. By day 2, the prisoners rebelled. They barricaded themselves in their cells, tore off their numbers, cursed at the guards. It was exactly what Zimbardo hoped for. Now he could see how the guards would restore order without rules. Guard Eshelman took charge. We need to break them psychologically, turn them against each other, make them think escape is impossible. The guards used fire extinguishers to force prisoners away from doors, stripped their beds, threw their belongings in the hall, put the leaders in solitary. But then came the psychological warfare. The guards created a privileged cell with beds and better food. Prisoners who cooperated got rewarded. Those who resisted got nothing. Within hours, prisoners were informing on each other for privileges. Clay Ramsey, prisoner 416, watched his fellow inmates turn. We went from solidarity to suspicion in one day. Guys were making deals with guards, snitching for blankets. The guards had us fighting each other instead of them. The most disturbing part, the guards invented it all themselves. No one taught them divide and conquer. No one suggested psychological manipulation. They discovered torture techniques through pure improvisation. By day 3, prisoner 8612 Doug Corpy had a breakdown. He started screaming, crying, rage-filled rants. "I can't take it anymore," he yelled. "You can't keep me here. This is fucked up. Let me out." Zimbardo thought he was faking to get released. The guards thought so too. They made his life worse, convinced he was manipulating them. But Corpy was genuinely breaking down. The line between experiment and reality had vanished in his mind. When Zimbardo finally interviewed him, Corpy was sobbing uncontrollably. "I feel like I'm losing my mind," he said. "I know it's an experiment, but I can't remember that when they're screaming at me. I believe I'm really a prisoner." Zimbardo released him, then did something that shows how deep he'd fallen into his own experiment. He worried about security. What if Corpy came back to break out his friends? Zimbardo increased guard shifts, added informants. He was thinking like a real prison warden. But wait, there's documented proof. This went beyond a simple experiment. Christina Maslach, Zimbardo's girlfriend and a recent Stanford PhD, came to observe on day 5. What she saw horrified her. Prisoners with bags over their heads, chains on their feet, being marched to the toilet. Guards screaming obscenities, prisoners sobbing. "I saw one boy break down crying," she later testified. "The guards were laughing at him. Phil was watching it all like it was perfectly normal. That's when I realized he had become the superintendent of his own sick prison." She confronted Zimbardo that night. "You're allowing abuse. You've lost perspective. Those aren't prisoners, they're boys, students, and you're torturing them." It was the first time anyone had used that word, torture. But here's the smoking gun. When Maslach threatened to report the experiment to the University Ethics Board, Zimbardo initially refused to stop it. He had commitments to the Office of Naval Research. He needed 2 weeks of data. The government was expecting results. Guard Eshelman had evolved into a pure sadist by day 5. He forced prisoners to clean toilets with their bare hands, made them do hundreds of jumping jacks, created a game where prisoners were camels and guards rode them. Each shift, he pushed further. "I felt this surge of power," Eshelman admits. "When they obeyed disgusting orders, I felt like a god. When they looked at me with hate but still did what I said, that was intoxicating. I understand now how genocide happens." Prisoner 416, Clay Ramsey, arrived late as a replacement. The guards saw fresh meat. They put him in solitary for hours before he'd done anything wrong. Made him believe the experiment would last weeks, not days. Convinced him the other prisoners hated him. By day 5, Ramsey was on a hunger strike. The guards put his dinner in front of his cell and made other prisoners watch it go to waste. Then gave them a choice. Let Ramsey out of solitary and everyone loses blankets, or keep him in the hole. The prisoners voted to keep him in solitary. This is where it becomes truly dark. Father McDermott, a Catholic priest who served as a prison chaplain, visited on day 5 at Zimbardo's request. He talked to each prisoner privately. When he left, he was shaking. Half the prisoners had introduced themselves by number, not name. They had internalized their prisoner identity completely. They weren't acting anymore, McDermott reported. They believed they were prisoners. When I asked about their parents, they asked if I could get lawyers. They thought they needed legal help to get out of a voluntary experiment. The Stanford County Jail's consultant came next. He walked through the prison and told Zimbardo it was one of the most realistic simulations he'd seen. The consultant said something that chilled everyone. "The only difference between your prison and mine is that yours will end." But would it? By day 6, Zimbardo was planning to move the experiment to an abandoned jail. He was adding new prisoners, creating parole boards, building a more elaborate torture system. He couldn't see how insane it had become. Here's the evidence of government involvement. Freedom of Information Act requests revealed the Office of Naval Research didn't just fund the experiment, they sent observers. Military psychologists sat behind Zimbardo's two-way mirrors taking notes. What made guards more sadistic? What broke prisoners faster? How could you create maximum psychological damage without leaving marks? The techniques developed at Stanford showed up at Guantanamo Bay. Abu Ghraib, CIA black sites, forced nudity, sleep deprivation, arbitrary rules, sexual humiliation. Every trick the Stanford guards invented became part of America's torture playbook. When the Abu Ghraib photos surfaced in 2004, showing U.S. soldiers torturing Iraqi prisoners, Zimbardo recognized the techniques immediately. The hoods, the nudity, the human pyramids. It was his basement experiment on a global scale. He testified at the court-martial of Staff Sergeant Ivan Frederick, one of the Abu Ghraib guards. The Stanford Prison Experiment shows how good people can become perpetrators of evil. Frederick isn't a bad apple. He's a good apple in a bad barrel. But that excuse rings hollow when you know the barrel was designed by psychologists. When you know the military studied how to create bad barrels. When you know your tax dollars funded research into making good people do evil things. The aftermath was devastating. When Zimbardo finally ended the experiment after 6 days, some prisoners couldn't believe it. They sat in their cells waiting for permission to leave. The psychological damage was that complete. They needed their torturer's approval to reclaim freedom. Doug Corpy, the first prisoner to break down, suffered PTSD for years. "I'd have nightmares about being prisoner 8612 again. I'd wake up reciting my number. It took therapy to remember I was never really a prisoner. It was just an experiment." Tom Thompson couldn't wear watches for a decade. They reminded him of the chains. Clay Ramsey developed claustrophobia so severe he couldn't use elevators. Richard Yacko had panic attacks whenever he saw police officers. But the guards suffered too. Dave Eshelman, John Wayne, went into therapy to understand how he became a sadist. "I did things I can't forgive myself for. I made human beings suffer for my amusement. How do you live with that? How do you trust yourself again?" Christopher Archer quit his graduate program in psychology. "I saw what I was capable of. I saw how easily I could be manipulated into evil. I didn't want to study the human mind anymore. I was afraid of what else I might find." But here's what they don't want you to know. The Stanford Prison Experiment wasn't unique. It was part of a larger CIA military program to understand psychological control. MK Ultra, SEER training, the Milgram experiments, decades of research into breaking human beings. Dr. Zimbardo made his career on that experiment: book deals, speaking tour, consulting fees. He became famous for discovering how easily people become evil, but he never talks about who paid for that discovery, who used those findings, who turned his research into real torture. In 2018, journalist Ben Blum exposed more lies. The guards were coached more than Zimbardo admitted. Some prisoners were told to act crazy. The breakdown of Doug Corpy. He later admitted he faked it to get out early because he had a graduate exam to study for. But even if parts were exaggerated, the core truth remains. Given power and permission, ordinary people will abuse others. The guards who weren't coached still became sadistic. The prisoners who weren't acting still broke down. The nightmare was real enough. Craig Haney, the graduate student who helped run it, became a prison reform advocate. He spent 40 years trying to atone. "We created a monster to study monstrosity. We traumatized kids to understand trauma. The irony is sickening. We became what we were studying." Here's the terrifying question nobody asks. If it was so easy to turn Stanford students into torturers in 1971, what about now? What about private prisons where profit depends on filled cells? What about detention centers with no oversight? What about secret facilities we don't even know exist? The experiment ended, but the knowledge didn't disappear. Somewhere right now, someone is using Zimbardo's findings, creating arbitrary rules, stripping identity, building dependence, turning guards into monsters and prisoners into numbers. We know it works. Stanford proved that. We know it's evil. The broken students proved that, but we keep building prisons, keep training guards, keep pretending it won't happen again. In 2003, Zimbardo visited Abu Ghraib. He walked through the cells where Iraqis were tortured using techniques pioneered in his basement. He saw the hoods, the chains, the sexual humiliation. He knew exactly where it came from. "I created this," he said. "Not directly, but I showed them the way. I gave them the blueprint. Every tortured prisoner at Abu Ghraib, I share responsibility for their suffering." The Office of Naval Research got what they paid for: a manual for breaking human beings, a recipe for institutional sadism, proof that anyone can become a torturer with the right environment. Your tax dollars at work. But there's one more twist. In 2018, recordings surfaced of Zimbardo coaching his guards. "Be tough," he told them. "Create fear." The neutral scientist was actually an active participant. He didn't just observe evil, he encouraged it. He needed dramatic results for his government funders. This changes everything. The Stanford Prison Experiment wasn't about discovering human nature. It was about manufacturing evidence for a predetermined conclusion. The government wanted to believe ordinary people could become torturers. Zimbardo gave them that belief, wrapped in academic credibility. Every police academy that teaches aggressive tactics, every military unit trained in enhanced interrogation, every prison guard told to maintain control at all costs, they all trace back to a basement in Stanford where the conclusion was decided before the experiment began. The real subjects weren't the students, they were us. The American public who would accept torture if it was backed by science, who would believe abuse was human nature rather than institutional choice, who would fund more research into breaking people rather than healing them. This is why they bury the CIA connection. When people think of the Stanford Prison Experiment, they think of a professor who got carried away. They don't think of government contracts, military applications, torture techniques being beta tested on college kids. That narrative is too dangerous. It's easier to blame human nature than human institutions. Easier to say power corrupts than we paid to learn how power corrupts so we could corrupt more efficiently. Easier to treat it as ancient history than ongoing practice. But the students remember. Doug Corpy remembers being prisoner 8612. Clay Ramsey remembers the hunger strike. Dave Eshelman remembers becoming John Wayne. They're in their 70s now, still carrying numbered trauma from 6 days in 1971. And Philip Zimbardo, he remembers too. In his nightmares, he's back in that basement. But he's not the superintendent anymore. He's a prisoner, and the guards all have his face. The Stanford Prison Experiment ended on August 20, 1971. The torture techniques it developed are still being used today. The only question is, where, on whom, and when will we finally learn that some knowledge comes at too high a price? The basement at Stanford is a computer lab now. Students work where prisoners once broke. They don't know the history beneath their feet, don't know their university once manufactured monsters to government specifications. But late at night, janitors report strange sounds. Whistles, counts, numbers being recited, cell doors that don't exist slamming shut. Just echoes, the university says, just pipes and ventilation. Just ghosts of an experiment that revealed who we really are, who we've always been, who will continue to be until we stop funding research into human cruelty and start funding research into human healing. The Stanford Prison Experiment is over. Its legacy is eternal. Every time a guard abuses power, Zimbardo's experiment succeeds again. Every time we look away, we become his accomplices. The real prison isn't in Stanford's basement. It's in what we learned there. And unlike the students, we haven't figured out how to leave. 6 days, 24 students, infinite damage, your government at work. Sleep tight.